I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. I certainly appreciate those of you who were able and willing to share the reasons why you wanted to be connected with our organization. As Ryan said, I am Trent Cockrum. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Hospice of the Piedmont, which also includes our affiliate organization, Hospice of Randolph and Asheboro. So our main campus is located at 1801 Westchester Drive in High Point, and then we also have a campus, as I mentioned, in Asheboro at 416 Vision Drive in Asheboro. We serve an 8-county region, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And a little bit about me. I've been with the organization almost 8 years. I came in 2013 as the organization's third chief executive officer in the organization's now nearly 40-year history. So we are an organization that has a tremendous legacy. Last year, as of October 1, 2019, we were very fortunate to have a good merger partner with our colleagues down in Asheboro with Hospice of Randolph, which of course, as I mentioned, is an affiliate of Hospice of the Piedmont. So without further ado, we're going to talk a little bit. I only see me on my screen, but please, I'm going to ask that Ryan or any of my other colleagues monitor the chat and or Q&A box and jump in at any time if there's a question that I'm missing or if somebody's got their hand up. So let's get started. Maybe. Well, my screen on advance. Oh, there we go. So our learning objectives. Participants will have a general understanding of hospice care and its place within the healthcare continuum. Participants will become familiar with Hospice of the Piedmont and Hospice of Randolph's history, organizational structure, and services. Interesting sidebar, our organization was formed in 1981, and Hospice of Randolph was formed in 1983, and we existed as friendly competitors for a number of years. Both of us were and still are nonprofit organizations. We simply operate as a singular organization today instead of two. And then participants will be introduced to the mission, values, ethical principles, and desired patient-family outcomes. So before we talk a little bit about that, I think it's important for us to set a little bit of context. You know, the slide that you have in front of you is pretty interesting. So particularly for me, I'm 46 years old. I'll be 47 on my birthday in December. And in 1900, so a little over about 120 years ago, I would have likely already have lived the entirety of my lifespan. Compared to 2013, which is now 78.7 years. So a good long while, now a big span of time between 1900 and 2013 and what we could expect in terms of mortality and longevity. Interestingly enough, at the turn of the last century, the leading cause of death were largely communicable diseases like pneumonia or tuberculosis or gastrointestinal infections, or even heart disease, which is still true today. As you can see just to the right, heart disease, cancer, lower respiratory diseases, and then of course we layer on accidents. At the turn of the 20th century, the normal place of death was really home or possibly a hospital, though hospitals were not as widely available then as they are today. And then in 2013, and it's the same then as it is today in 2020, a home, a hospital, or even now a long-term care facility. In 1900, the cost of care was borne primarily by the family. And then in 2013, and the same today, we have Medicare or other insurance providers are actually bearing the cost of most of the care that is being provided in the country. And an interesting disparity between a little over a century ago and today is that at the turn of the 20th century, normally, it was not normal for people to be disabled before their death. That was really unusual. But in the latter half of the 20th century, and certainly now into the second decade of the 21st century, we see that generally, yes, people are generally disabled before they die, because often they may have lived for many years, if not decades, with an advanced chronic illness or a progressive chronic illness that has gotten worse over the years. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's look at how we live and how we die. And this is on the left side of the screen. You can see number of deaths per 1,000, again, at the beginning of the 20th century. And we talked about just a few moments ago that most of those were from communicable diseases like pneumonia or influenza. If you follow from the bottom up, tuberculosis, gastrointestinal infections, and heart disease. Heart disease was in the top 4. It's still in the top 5 today, if not the number 1 cause of death in the country. Followed then by cerebral vascular diseases like dementias and things like that. Neuropathies for diseases of the kidneys, followed by accidents. Cancer is really far down the list. Senility, which is a type of dementia, and then of course diphtheria, which is also of course a communicable disease. And then we fast forward to 2013. So just a few years ago, heart disease is number 1, followed by a close second by cancer. And that is not inconsistent with what we experience in our own hospice program. Many of the patients that we take care of, over 2,000 of patients in a given year, many of them, about a quarter of them, will have some form of cardiopulmonary disease, like a heart disease or some other pulmonary disease like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, or any other pulmonary associated disease, followed then of course by cancer, chronic lower respiratory diseases, we just talked about that, accidents, cerebral vascular diseases, Alzheimer's disease, you see that creep in, diabetes, you see that show up as well, influenza, pneumonia, neuropathies or diseases of the kidneys, and then intentional self-harm. Many people, as they look at this, they think, gosh, you know, what really happened? Well, aside from the obvious considerations of tremendous advances in medical science and a better way of living, you know, we have clean water now, and we have a lot of things that we didn't have well over 100 years ago. One of the questions that I get asked so very often is, well, gosh, at the turn of the century, at the turn of the last century, why weren't people dying of cancer, for example? Did it simply not exist in the population? Well, if we think about that for just a moment, the reality is that oftentimes people at the turn of the last century simply did not live long enough to develop many of the diseases that we see today, which is why oftentimes the causal factor for their death was generally not a debilitating condition of a prolonged nature, but oftentimes a very debilitating condition of an incredibly short or acute duration. So let's move on for just a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more about how we live and how we die. And, you know, because I think we cannot talk about what we do in our organization, what we do in hospice, what we do in life, if we're unable to think about considerations about living and dying, because we are born, and then in 2013, if we continue our normal lifespan, we could expect to live about 78.7 years. I think it's a little more than that now, about 79.2 or something. I think women have a much a longer lifespan than men do. But if we were to think that life happens without death, then we're doing ourselves a great disservice. I think I heard some of you were talking about that as part of your interest in being a part of our organization and just learning more about it. And so one of the things that I think that is most interesting, if you take health on the far left of this graph and age at the very bottom, and you have end of life over here, I think I can use a pointer, yep. And you see this long, slow arch, right? So that's what many of us would just term as growing old and then just dying. You know, we have good health, and over the course of our lifetime, many years, many decades, you know, imagine that this is about 78.7 years, right? Maybe 80, could be longer, who knows? We have this long, nice sloping arc of reasonably good health, but then, you know, we just get old and things happen and then we just die. And that's what we all would consider in a normal term of growing old gracefully and then just dying. And this is another interesting take on that same consideration, right? You have health still on the left, you've got age at the along the bottom axis here, and you've got end of life here, and you live for a while and then it just drops off rather precipitously. Well, that could mean a couple different things. That could mean quite literally falling off of a cliff. I don't think any of you who are joining me here today would imagine that if you fell off a cliff, you could not fathom that you might meet the end of your life at the bottom of the cliff, right? I mean, that seems to be a logical consideration. But what this also could be, aside from falling off a cliff, is it could be an illness of an incredibly short duration, a very acute illness of an incredibly short duration, like a sudden heart attack or a catastrophic stroke, or any number of other things that could befall us in a very short span of time, for which there may be little opportunity to recover, which may be the proximal cause for the end of our life. And so we call that sort of simply falling off a cliff, because that does sometimes happen to people, right? We all probably know people who died rather unexpectedly, and this is oftentimes in a graphical representation what that might actually look like. And then there's another more interesting graph, I think. And a little bit more about me. Prior to coming to Hospice of the Piedmont, I spent about 16 years in a senior care organization, working with seniors, working with home health delivery, working in skilled nursing, working with assisted living and independent living, but primarily working with a group of seniors or geriatric population of individuals. And what was so interesting to me right out of college, as I sort of entered that first 16 years or so of my career prior to coming to Hospice of the Piedmont, I began to realize some real common themes that I saw among most people. Now, we've talked a little bit about the growing old gracefully and then just sort of dying. We've talked about falling off a cliff or having a really sudden event that happens and that offers little opportunity for recovery, from which we may die. But then there's this graph, which is the most interesting, I think. You've got health over here and age again at the bottom, and you've got end of life over here. And you're living pretty good for a while, right? You're living for a number of years, maybe up until the time that you're about 46 or 47 years old, or even a little older. And then you start to have some health issues, right? You start to have a period of sickness, followed by a period of wellness, followed by a period of sickness, followed by a period of good wellness, even better wellness, little sicker here. You get the picture, right? You have a lot of peaks and troughs. This is what I call the roller coaster ride, right? Because that's what many of the patients that come into our service have actually experienced for the last several years, if not a couple of decades. Because again, it is not unusual for us today to realize some disability prior to death, if not in the years immediately prior to, perhaps even for a decade or more. And so if you imagine that the peaks are periods of wellness and the troughs are periods of illness, you see as you continue down this roller coaster that they get much deeper. The periods of illness become much more prolonged. The periods of wellness become much shorter in duration before the next period of sickness. And you sort of repeat this cycle over and over again until you reach the end of life. And that is what, in my experience, I would consider to be the most normal course for many people. This is what happens to many, many people over the span of their lifetime. And what's particularly interesting about all of this is what happens when you layer on hospice. So it's a known fact that patients who receive hospice care live on average 25% longer than patients with the same diagnosis who do not receive hospice care. There are lots of reasons for that. We can talk about those in a bit. The least of which is when we feel better, we live better, right? But this is really what happens. This is oftentimes more the rule as opposed to the exception when we are working with people who may have had this experience for a number of years in their life, and then they come onto our program. At this point in their life, they may have anywhere from, an involvement of 8 to 10 different physicians, maybe taking 25 to 32 different medications. None of that is an unusual consideration for us at all. But what happens with almost all of those patients, almost all of those individuals who have lived this life, just like we have described it and talked about it, is you see a smoothing out of the periods of sickness and the periods of wellness. I think it's important to note for context that the period of sickness, obviously they're a hospice patient, they're incredibly sick, but their periods of wellness actually get a little bit longer. They actually begin to feel better because, again, when we live better, when we feel better, we live better, and consequently often is the case that we live longer. So I think that's just a really interesting thing to note. And it's really by and large what we experience with almost all of our patients. There are a number of factors that inform this, of course, as with everything. This is the experience for most of our patients. But what really does inform that is where you are in the trajectory of your illness when you come into our program, right? The earlier individuals seek hospice care, the more likely they are to have a much longer, more well developed quality of life than they would if they come in at the very end, towards the more terminal phases of their illness. Oh, I think there's a question. Oh, I'm going to let you guys take care of this, Ryan, if you don't mind. So moving on. Maybe. So these are the considerations that we've talked about. This sort of long, slow arch of growing old sort of gracefully and dying. This falling off a cliff or having an illness of incredibly short, maybe perhaps very acute duration for which there is little opportunity for recovery. This roller coaster, which is what we discussed that most people likely experience leading up to the end of their life. And then what it looks like when we layer hospice on to this. For this, there's little opportunity for hospice, though there is some. But for this, for folks who've had a long, protracted period of time of living with an advanced chronic illness, this is where we have the greatest opportunity to provide the most valuable services for the patient and for their family. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the hospice movement. You know, taking care of sick and infirm people is not new. We've been doing it for a millennia or better. You know, if you think about what our engagements were in medieval times, oftentimes religious groups, monks, and even nuns would take in individuals who were sick and infirm, and they would take care of them for the duration of their life, for whatever period of time that might be. Again, they were largely religious sects or driven by religious orders of individuals all across Europe, really. But the notion, again, of taking care of individuals, taking care of those who need our greatest help, really is a human attribute. It is something that we as humans do, not uniquely. There are other groups of animals who do that, but we do it in a really unique way because we understand the conscience of being, right? We understand that it is incredibly important and that humans play an incredibly important role to other humans and that we have a responsibility to one another. And so the concept of taking care of individuals really is not new. It spans nearly a millennia. But if we fast forward from the medieval times, so the 14th, 15th century, on up until the middle part of the 20th century, a lady by the name of Dame Cecily Saunders, who was first a social worker, then a nurse, and ultimately a physician, she hypothesized that individuals who are at or approaching the end of their life had a unique set of needs. They had a unique set of psychosocial needs, they had a unique set of medical needs, they had a unique set of spiritual needs. And she believed that if she surrounded not only the patient, the individual who was living with the disease, but also their family with a multidisciplinary group of individuals who could minister in the non-ecumenical sense to those individuals' needs, then she hypothesized that she could actually improve their life, improve the quality of their life, lessen the amount of depression that they may have, and even improve the caregiving experience, if not lessen the caregiving burden that the caregivers around the individual might actually have. And she believed that. And so out of that notion began the modern day hospice movement. And in 1967, Dame Cecily Saunders founded the first modern day hospice organization, St. Christopher's Hospice. It is the longest and oldest operating hospice organization in the world. It's still operating today in London. But it was opened in 1967 and was built upon all of the premise, again, that individuals who are at or approaching the end of their life have a really unique set of medical needs, psychosocial needs, and spiritual needs. And surrounding them with those individuals and their family with a multidisciplinary group who have tremendous experience in each of those spaces could be incredibly advantageous, not only for the patient, but also for their family. And so she founded the first modern hospice. And as things happen sometimes, the hospice movement found its way from Great Britain to New Haven, Connecticut in 1974, and Hospice of Connecticut was formed. And it became, much like many organizations across the country at that time, it was a grassroots movement that was begun by a group of volunteers, most notably of which was the dean of the Yale the Yale Nursing School, who resigned her position as the dean of the nursing school that actually formed the hospice organization. And so that movement at the time began permeating across the country, and it found its way to High Point, North Carolina in 1981. In 1981, Hospice of the Piedmont was formed. Actually, it was Hospice at High Point at the time. It was formed in 1981 by a group of volunteers who had the same notion as named Cecily Saunders. They knew, in fact, that people who were at or approaching the end of life had a really unique set of needs. They had a unique set of psychosocial needs, medical needs, and spiritual needs. And then, not too far away from us, just 25 miles down the road, our now affiliate organization, Hospice of Randolph County, was formed in 1983. And what was so interesting about that span of time from 1974 to about 1985 is that hospice was being delivered by a lot of organizations, not unlike our own, across the country. The care was being delivered truly by volunteers. Only the nurses and the physicians had the medical training. Everybody else truly were volunteers. We had actually no employees at the time. Everybody was a volunteer in 1981 and 1983. And the way in which hospice care was actually being funded at the time was an incredibly cumbersome mechanism. It is so interesting. What's so interesting about hospice is that it's neither home health and it's not home care. And there is a benefit, a Medicare benefit for home health. And many of the people that we were taking care of in 1981 became Medicare eligible, either because they were at a Medicare eligible age or because they had met the disability criteria for Medicare eligibility. And so there was a home health benefit, but hospice really doesn't fit in a home health benefit. Home health is generally episodic. The approach to home health is very different. Even in 1981, the way it was organized was just really very different and didn't fit the purposes that we had developed an organization to provide care in. And so that was not just here in High Point or in Randolph County, that was across the country. And so in about 1983, the United States Congress did what the United States Congress does. They began to study what was happening in hospice. They realized that there were a lot of grassroots hospice organizations that were getting started across the country, and they needed to understand whether or not there was tremendous value in the care that was actually being provided by these organizations, if not even just to understand a bit more about what it was that they were actually doing. And so they undertook a demonstration project in which all the hospices in the country participated in. Now there are over 5,000. At the time, we were talking a few hundred hospice organizations. And they sought to understand what actually happened with patients who were under the care of a hospice organization. What they found was astounding. Through the end of their demonstration project, they realized that patients who were receiving hospice care, again, lived on average about 25% longer than patients who had the same diagnosis who didn't receive hospice care. They had a lesser incidence of depression, but not only did they have a lesser incidence of depression, so did their family. That that their family actually had a lessened caregiving burden because of the support that they received from the hospice care organization. And then most importantly, and this is what I call the what's in it for me factor, because we were asking at the time, all the way back in 1985 or 83, there was a significant effort to lobby the United States Congress to begin formulating a new benefit just for hospice because it didn't fit in the home health benefit. And so the what's in it for me as it relates to Congress was as they began looking at what happened with all of the patients that were cared for by hospice organizations across the country. Not only did they live longer, not only was their quality of life assessed as being markedly better than individuals who didn't receive hospice care, not only was there a lesser incidence of depression among the patient population and consequently among the population of their family. But most importantly, individuals who are receiving hospice care consumed fewer healthcare resources than individuals who had the same diagnosis who did not receive hospice care. So to put that in some perspective, people lived better, they lived longer, 25% longer, in fact. And that's been a study that has been proven time and time again over the course of the last 30, almost 40 years. So not only did they live better, not only did they live longer, but they also cost the healthcare system less money by consuming fewer resources. So in reality, that is a win-win-win, and it's a win-win for everybody. It was a win for the Medicare system or the federal government, which is the largest single purchaser of healthcare services in the entire country. And it was a win for the patient and family, most importantly. And so in 1985, the United States Congress legislated the hospice Medicare benefit into law, and it has remained largely unchanged in that span of time, so almost 40 years. Pretty interesting story, I think, and certainly a great story of where we can truly say Congress really did the right thing, and they did the right thing for all of the right reasons, which is a tremendous accomplishment. So how we are organized, we are structured as a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. We're going to talk about that for just a moment. We also serve an 8-county service area, and we are governed by a volunteer board of directors. So it organizes a 501c3 organization, which really just means, in its grandest sense, that we do not pay property or income taxes. Does not mean that we do not have a responsibility to operate a fiscally or financially prudent organization, but does mean that our purpose is more important, not more important than the financial considerations of our organization, but equally important as the financial purposes of our organization. But we are not in business to fulfill the needs of shareholders. We are in business to fulfill the needs of our community and those patients and families whom we're privileged to serve. That's what it really means to be a nonprofit organization. That's what it really means to be a not-for-profit hospice care organization. There's a great misconception that many hospice organizations, or that all hospice organizations, are connected to one another, and that actually could not be further from the truth. We are all separate and independent financial entities who really only agreed by virtue of signing a contract with the federal government that we will provide hospice services. But the way and manner in which each organization goes about providing those services is vastly different. And our organization, for example, as I mentioned, is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. Other organizations that provide hospice care may be publicly traded, may be a for-profit entity. So the manner in which organizations are actually formulated and structured varies from hospice organization to hospice organization, and the services within each of the organizations and their delivery of those services varies widely from organization to organization. Okay. So as I mentioned, we are governed by a volunteer board of directors. We have a 22-member board of directors, of which I have a responsibility to. They represent our entire service area, so they're from all different places across our entire service area, and they have responsibility for the governance of our organization. Our guiding principles. You know, we talk a lot about needs, wants, and priorities in our organization. You know, if you think about just basically what those words mean, needs are what we need, what's important to us, what we must have in order to live a fulfilling life. What our wants are, what we want in order to be able to live a fulfilling life or a more fulfilled life. And then the priority, how we need to arrange those needs and wants so that we're able to live life to the fullest. And regardless of where we are in our lifespan, we all think about needs, wants, and priorities. And as we grow older, the things that are most important to us, for example, when we were 20 or 21, are going to be vastly different than what our needs, wants, and priorities might be when we are 50 or 51 or 70 or 71. Be vastly different, and they're informed by a lot of things that happen in our life. They're informed by the needs of our family. They're informed by the needs of our own intrinsic needs, what's important to us as an individual. And then it's also informed by a lot of other things too, right? Like our health and well-being. What are the things that are most important to us? What is it that we need? What is it that we want? And what is it and how is it that we are going to actually order those and what priority to be able to effectuate those for ourselves to attain some life fulfillment. So we talk a lot about that, but you know, most importantly, what we talk about is our mission. And our mission couldn't be any more simple. We connect patients and their families to the care they need on the terms they choose. That's what we do. That's what we do every day. That's what we've done every day since our organization was founded in 1981. We determine what their needs are. We listen to what their wants are. And then we help them prioritize those in a way that is beneficial for them, to help them realize all of that together, because that is truly connecting individuals to the care they need on the terms they choose. And it's not just the individual that we're serving, it's the entire unit of care, which extends out to the family, because we understand that not only do patients have a unique set of medical, psychosocial, and spiritual needs, their family does too. Their family has a really unique set of psychosocial and certainly spiritual needs. And all of that really affects, in many ways, the needs, wants, and priorities for the patient. And so all of those are really important, but simply put, all we do is we connect patients and their families to the care they need on the terms they choose. So let's talk a little bit about our programs. We have hospice in-home care. That's about 95% of all the services that we provide are actually provided in a patient's home or wherever they call home. Could be a nursing home, could be an assisted living, could be in their own private residence. That's about 95% of all the services that we provide. We also have Hospice Home at High Point, which is an 18-bed inpatient facility located just on our campus in High Point at 1803 Westchester Drive. We have the Randolph Hospice House, which is a 16-bed inpatient facility located just adjacent to our offices in Randolph County at 446 Vision Drive in Asheboro. We also have Care Connection, which is a palliative care program. We'll talk a little bit more about palliative care. This is an interdisciplinary physician-led palliative care program, one of the more unique ones like it, one of the few like it in all of North Carolina, something that we are very proud of. Our Kids Path program. Kids Path is a program specifically for individuals who are younger than the age of 18 or have a developmental age of younger than the age of 18. So Kids Path serves a couple of different purposes. The primary purpose is to provide counseling for individuals who have a developmental age of younger than the age of 18 when they have experienced a death. Due perhaps someone that they care deeply about, a mom, a dad, a grandmother, grandfather, because we all understand that children deal with and cope with grief very differently than we do as adults. And so having a counselor or a number of counselors actually who understand that is incredibly important and very mission-centric to our organization. The other consideration that Kids Path provides for our organization is pediatric hospice services, of which there is very little need, but we do have on occasion, from time to time, pediatric hospice patients. And they too have a very unique set of needs, but not only do the children have a very unique set of needs, so do the parents. And so our job for Kids Path counselors and nurses and even physicians is to understand those needs and understand how they differ from the primary population that we're taking care of, which are largely adult, from 65 to about 85 years of age or older. That represents, our Kids Path service statistics represent a very small service statistic for our organization, but represents an incredibly large portion of what we do in bereavement services. As you might imagine, in today's world of where we have many families that look very different perhaps from the families that many of us may have grown up with or in, we have many non-natural families. So we may be taking care of an individual in the home for which there may be multiple generations of a family living in the home, some of which may be children who are younger than the age of 18. And in those cases, our Kids Path counselors become the social work staff to those cases to begin working with those individuals through the anticipatory bereavement process and then continue with them through the bereavement process. Our Kids Path program, by and large, is supported entirely by public support, which is a really important consideration, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Our Grief Counseling Center, which is also available to individuals who have experienced a loss due to death of a person. One might be surprised that on occasion we do get a call from individuals in the community who have lost a near and dear pet, and we're very sensitive to that, but unfortunately that's simply not what our organization does, and simply not the services that we offer through our Grief Counseling service or through our Grief Counseling Center. Our Grief Counseling Center is staffed by qualified grief counselors. They're licensed professional counselors who have additional credentials in providing services to bereaved individuals, so they're very skilled at bereavement counseling. They provide both in-person counseling, one-on-one counseling, and then also group counseling offerings throughout the course of any given year. Right now, as you might imagine, all of those offerings are currently virtual, but they are still ongoing. The Grief Counseling Center also is supported entirely by public support. As I mentioned previously, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And part of what that means, I believe, for our organization is it implies that we have a social contract with our community. And in exchange for our willingness to provide grief counseling services and Kids Path services, or even providing services to an individual in our community, regardless of their ability to pay or financial circumstance, that implies that we have a contract with the community that asks them for support from time to time throughout the year. So we will provide the services that we've talked about, regardless of an individual's ability to pay, in exchange for the generous support of the community, for which our community has been incredibly generous. And in fact, 95% of every dollar that is given, 92% of every dollar that is given to our organization goes right back to patient care, an incredibly important statistic to our organization. So let's move on. So let's talk a little bit about hospice care. Hospice care offers palliative rather than curative treatment. And we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about palliative care, but palliation simply means to alleviate the symptom. To effectively palliate a symptom, we are just alleviating the symptom. We are not focused on the curative measures of care. We are focused really on controlling symptoms, whatever those symptoms might be. Oftentimes we think about individuals who are in our service who may have cancer, but that only accounts for about 32% of our total patient population in the course of any given year. About 68% of our total population have other maladies and diseases like cardiopulmonary disease, which often require a significant amount of palliation for their disease process. But we do not focus on the curative aspects of care. Our care addresses the physical, psychosocial, and spiritual dimensions of living in the final stages of life. It emphasizes quality rather than length of life, though we all know, and you've heard me talk about several times now during our presentation, that patients who receive hospice care live on average about 25% longer than individuals who do with the same diagnosis who do not receive hospice care. We regard death as a natural part of the life cycle, seeking neither to hasten nor unnaturally postpone death. So death is a very natural course of life. You know, there are two things in life that we really cannot fix. One is aging and the other is dying. Those are the two unfixables in life, right? We're destined to get old and we are ultimately destined to die. And that looks really different for different people, and their needs, wants, and priorities around that are different from person to person as well, and maybe different from family to family, which is also informed by not only just their individual familial beliefs, but also any cultural or religious beliefs that they may have. I might add that we are a non-denominational organization, so we provide care to just about any sort of faith tradition that you could imagine if it exists within our 8-county service area. Most often is the case that we have provided some service to those individuals or to that faith-based group, which is really interesting. Each individual in our care and their families are considered the unit of care. You heard me talk a little bit ago about providing services just to the patient, but beyond the patient, our service really extends out to the family as well. Not our medical services to the family, but our spiritual and psychosocial services are certainly a natural extension, are certainly naturally extended out to the family. We often find that is the most beneficial consideration of our involvement with the family. Care for the families does not end at their loved one's death. We actually provide bereavement services for up to 13 months following the death of an individual. And you may think, gosh, why 13? 13 is that's such a strange number. But if you think about it, 13 hits all the firsts. It's the first anniversary of the patient's death. It's the first wedding anniversary. It's the first birthday. It's the first 4th of July, the first Thanksgiving, the first Christmas. It's all of the first important dates that happen during the first 13 months of any given year for any individual. And so our job, our responsibility to the family is to really help ensure that they have the skills necessary to cope with the loss that they've had. And that's where our Grief Counseling Center comes in and plays a very important role in that. Our care is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We are a supportive care organization. You know, many people have a belief that we come and we stay in the home, and that's simply not what we were set up to do at all. But we are a tremendous support to the patient and also to the family, and oftentimes helping them truly do extraordinary things. You know, if you think about when most people are coming into our service, they're scared, they're exhausted, they're, oftentimes overwhelmed, if not overburdened by the caregiving responsibilities that they have for caring for someone with an advanced chronic disease or advanced illness. And they simply are just overwhelmed. And so when they come into our service, they're very scared. And what we do is help support them through the essential transitions of life. And so what we begin on day one is helping them set some realistic expectations of the next series of events that can happen. Because in the absence of our being able to think about the next series of things that are going to happen, when one of them does happen, we panic. And that's simply not the life that we want for our patients, and simply not the life that we want for our families. Because if you remember that roller coaster, that was really the life that many of them may have led for many years, if not decades, leading up to the time that they were involved in our organization. So our job is to help smooth out some of those rough transitions in care, and to help the patient and family understand the next series of things that are going to be happening in the context of their illness. What are the things that you could expect next? And P.S., we're going to tell you how to handle that. So we're going to help you become, we're going to empower you really to become an exceptional caregiver. So we're going to take you from an ordinary person, because most of the people that we're taking care of, their caregivers were not nurses and doctors. They were just everyday people who led everyday lives until they suddenly found themselves overwhelmed, if not overburdened, by the caregiving responsibilities of providing services, sometimes 24 hours a day, for a loved one. And they find themselves in a circumstance for which they feel completely unprepared. And so our job is to help them understand, we're going to help support you through this. We understand. And our goal is to make you an exceptional caregiver and to give you all the tools that you need to empower you to become exceptional. And by and large, that is what we do each and every day in our organization for more than 2,000 patients each year. This is what hospice care looks like as a graphic. You have the patient and family in the middle, then you've got all of these other ancillary services around them. You've got nurses, you've got physicians and nurse practitioners, you've got volunteers, an incredibly important member of the hospice care team. You've got social workers, chaplains, you've got our bereavement folks, and then you've got our ancillary support staff that help make our organization function, right? All of those are really important people, and all of us play an important role in ensuring that the care that we are able to provide is provided consistent with the patient's wants, needs, and priorities. So let's talk a little bit about palliative care versus hospice care. So it's an interesting fact, 78% of Americans have rarely heard of palliative care, and I would say that 22% of them actually believe that palliative care and hospice care are exactly the same thing. In reality, they're a little different. So palliative care is a medical specialty which focuses on symptom management and helping patients and families establish really complex goals of care. What are your medical needs, wants, and priorities? What can we help you achieve? What can we help you achieve medically? So those are those really complex goals of care. Do you want to go back to the hospital if you get sick again? Oftentimes is the case that many of our patients will say, you know, I've been in and out of the hospital for the last 5 years. That's the last place I want to go. That gives us a starting point. That helps us understand better your needs, wants, and priorities. So it helps patients and families better coordinate their healthcare services, right? All of those are palliative care. Palliative care can be provided during all phases of illness for short periods of time, for long periods of time. It can be provided intermittently from time to time. Palliative care is really, truly a medical specialty. It is a defined medical specialty, not unlike dermatology or any other medical specialty that you might conjure in your mind. There is a separate educational curriculum specifically for physicians who wish to be board certified in palliative medicine. And so when you take all the tenets of palliative medicine and you bundle it together with things like coverage for biologicals and drugs and nursing supplies and coverage for durable medical equipment like a bed or oxygen concentrator, when you bundle it together with services to include services like services of a visiting nurse or a chaplain or a social worker, then you've really arrived at this concept of hospice. So hospice is really just a bundled payment. It's a bundled service that is a defined medical benefit that uses all the tenets of palliative medicine. Everything we know from palliative medicine, we incorporate into hospice, but we layer on an additional series of really wonderful things. Again, coverage for drugs and biologicals and medical supplies and the services of visiting nurses and chaplains and social workers and physicians and nurse practitioners. And when we layer all of that together, we have created hospice. Now, what's so interesting, hospice is a benefit that's covered by Medicare, Medicaid, and most major insurers. And individuals are eligible for hospice if they have a life-limiting illness and have a prognosis of 6 months or less if the disease continues its normal course. And I want to stop there for just a moment. Many people believe that 6 months is the maximum benefit, which it is absolutely not. There are many people in our program that may stay in our program for much longer than 6 months, but they still have an estimated prognosis of 6 months or less. Okay. So by law, by federal law, we are required to have a physician certify that every individual in our program during the course of a year, at the time of their admission and at periodic intervals throughout their time on our service, that the physician must certify that they have an estimated prognosis of 6 months or less. So the great thing about that is that it does not mean that at the end of 6 months or 180 days, we say, wow, congratulations, you've graduated from hospice. That's simply not what we do. Though it is possible that people may come into and out of our program at different intervals throughout over the course of several years, that too is pretty rare, but does happen from time to time. But many people conflate the notion that eligibility for hospice means that death is very near. And that's simply not the case. It needn't be the case. It oftentimes may be the case, but that's really informed by a lot of factors, the least of which is when you actually come into our program and where you are in the trajectory of your illness. So it's informed by a lot of different factors. But 6 months is not the maximum period of time that an individual can be in hospice. But in order to qualify for hospice care, an individual must have a life-limiting illness, and they must have an estimated prognosis of 6 months or less if the disease continues its normal course, and that must be certified by penalty of law by a physician. Okay. How does hospice care work? So hospice care has a capitated payment structure, which is really sort of fancy healthcare finance speak for the dollars that we get are all the dollars that we get. And if we spend more, fine, but we won't get any more for the services, right? So let's think about that for just a second. What's covered? All drugs related to the hospice diagnosis, all durable medical equipment like hospital beds, wheelchairs, oxygen, all of those sorts of things. All medically necessary supplies like gloves and wound care supplies, visits by nurses, social workers, chaplains, physicians, nurse practitioners, and volunteers. For a person who's in their home, we're going to pay for all of those services for out of about $140 per day. And normally, if we were in a room together, I would see you sort of gasp or your eyes get larger. And I'm not seeing anybody on my screen today, but that's an astounding feat, I do believe. So if we spend 170 or 200 or 300 or 500, we're only going to get 140. That's all the federal government says we're going to get. Now, there are some different payment structures that work a little differently for inpatient hospice care. So if we're in our hospice home at High Point or in our Randolph Hospice House, but that accounts for an incredibly small amount of our total patient volume during the course of any year. So most of the patients that are receiving services from our organization fall into this category that you see on your screen. We're providing all the services for about $140 a day, roughly. And so it's an incredibly, but I will tell you it's an incredibly robust service. But this underscores why considerations of public support are so very important to our organization. There are a couple of chats in here. I appreciate that, Amelia. I think that's low too. We certainly share that notion. And it is pretty astounding that we're able to provide all of the rich benefits that we are able to provide for such a low reimbursement rate. But thank you for that. But I think that's really important to note, is that we are a capitated payment structure. And within that capitated payment, you receive a tremendous benefit for the services. So where is hospice care provided? In their private home. It's about 91% of all of our services, all of our patient days. So one patient is on service for 1 day, that's one patient day. 2 patients are on service for 30 days. That would be 60 days of 60 patient care days, right? So 91% of all of our patient care days are actually provided in a home or in a nursing home or an assisted living, any one of those. Less than 1% of all of our services are actually provided in a hospital. In fact, I just looked last week. For this year, we're at less than 0.4% of all of our patient days are actually in a hospital. Simply put, most of our patients do not want to go back to the hospital because they've had significant experience in the hospital, and that's simply not something that they're interested in having for a prolonged period of time. About 8% of our total patient days are in a hospice inpatient facility. So in the hospice home at High Point or in the Randolph Hospice House. So again, a very small number of our patient days are actually provided in one of our inpatient facilities. A note about our inpatient facilities. Our inpatient facilities really provide a hospital type of care. So it's care for incredibly acutely ill people who would otherwise be in a hospital if not for our hospice inpatient facility. So many times is the case that we will receive patients directly from a hospital into our inpatient facility, or oftentimes is the case that we may have individuals in our home care program who may come into and out of, from time to time, our inpatient facility. And on average, about 20% of all the patients in our inpatient facilities are actually transitioning out to another care setting after about 7 or 7.5 days. So it's a very short stay facility, hence the small number of beds. A very short stay facility, and about 20% of those are actually transitioning out to another care setting. So just a little sidebar about our inpatient facilities. Who receives hospice care? I think this is a really interesting demographic sheet. 57% are female, 43% are male. That pretty much mirrors just about what we see in the total local population. Only about 1% under the age of 40, and about 87% or so are between the ages of 65 and older, which is also not particularly surprising considering we talked about lifespan a little bit earlier, and about 12% from the ages of 40 to 64. Many people believe that hospice care is really just for patients who have cancer, and that really couldn't be further from the truth, as you see from this statistic just to the right. On average, about 33% of all of our patients in a year's time, so about 2,000 patients, have a cancer diagnosis, which really means that about 67% of them actually have something different than cancer. They have something that you can see down here. They have cardiac diseases, they have neurological diseases, respiratory diseases. In fact, almost a quarter of our 2,000 patients have some form of cardiopulmonary disease. You have about 11% that have protein malnutrition or other diagnoses. 6% diseases of the liver and the digestive system, and about 2% that have kidney failure and end-stage renal disease. And a note about cancer diagnoses, that is for the primary purpose for which we have them on our service, right? If you have COPD and you also have some other form of diagnosis, like perhaps you have protein malnutrition, then if COPD is your primary diagnosis, then we're going to consider you to have had a respiratory disorder, not a disease of the kidney or a neuropathic. Yes, nephropathies, sorry. Interesting statistic, 33% of our patients have cancer, 67% have a non-cancer diagnosis, and that is consistent year over year over year. What we have seen, if we were to go back to about 1982, 1983, we would have seen this look really different. We would have seen our age demographics look very different, and we would have seen our diagnostic profile look really different. It would have been probably closer to about 65% cancer, about another 35% HIV or AIDS, and then another 5% of whatever other diseases there happen to have been. Maybe heart disease, could be cardiopulmonary diseases, and a few other diseases sprinkled in there. So, you know, medical advances have changed dramatically. We have people now who are living with a number of chronic diseases for a number of years prior to their ever needing hospice, and may ever not even need them at all. So let's move on. Is hospice care just for the last days of life? No, not at all. You know, it's a common misconception that hospice care is just for the last days of life. Again, many things inform the length of stay that you may have in a hospice stay. It's informed by where you are in the trajectory of your illness. It's informed by the illness itself. It's informed by how incredibly debilitated you may be as a result of the illness or other associated health factors that you may have. So it's informed by a lot of different things. But many people would believe that hospice is just for the last days of life, when in truth, we can actually provide a much greater service to the patient and their family the longer they are on service, because we have an opportunity to truly understand their needs, wants, and priorities over a span of time, and have the opportunity for those to develop and perhaps even change, which is not the case if people are coming to us in just the last days of life, because we have a very limited opportunity to understand that. We will do our very best, but our greatest opportunity is when we have an ability to interact with the patient and their family for a prolonged period of time, much longer than, say, 2 weeks. Our average length of stay right now is about 55 days. So on average, people are in our program for around 55 days. And our median length of stay is about 13 days. So half of our patients are in our program much longer than 13 days. Half the patients are in our program for much shorter than 13 days. On average, about 54 days, somewhere around in there, which is still much shorter than the 6-month estimated prognosis that qualifies you for hospice care. In accordance with federal law, to be eligible for hospice care, an individual must have a life-limiting disease and have a prognosis of 6 months or less. And again, you've heard me talk about this several times. It's a common misconception that hospice care is for the last days of life. Studies show, however, that individuals who receive hospice care can live on average 25% longer than individuals with the same diagnosis who do not receive hospice care. What are the virtues of hospice care? You know, it really does help individuals define their wants, needs, and priorities as end of life approaches. That's really important. Oftentimes we go through life and we're so focused on the end result. The end result in this context perhaps is a cure, that we oftentimes don't stop to think of what might be most important to us. And I'm going to tell you a couple stories in just a moment. The support our organization gives each day empowers caregivers with the confidence needed during an emotionally and physically challenging time. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, that is absolutely spot on. Hospice helps individuals and families cope better with complex medical, spiritual, and psychosocial issues at end of life. Also very true. We meet everybody where they are. You know, that could be quite literally, could also be physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Oftentimes is the case is that there may be significant disconnect between the patient and between their family. And that's where I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. So I'll tell you a story about my friend Terry. Terry was a lovely lady. She's still alive. She has since retired. But Terry was a very interesting person. Terry worked for a printing company that we used here at Hospice of the Piedmont. And after the first year I'd been here, I'd known Terry for a good long while. And Terry was an individual who had a tremendous amount of energy. So, and she still does. So when she would call you, she would say, "Hey, Trent, hey, this is Terry. How you doing?" "Fine, Terry, what's going on?" She would want to tell me whatever it was that she needed to tell me. And, but what was so interesting about Terry is that she would call me and have that tremendous energy when I answered the phone, and she would have that similar amount of energy when I didn't answer the phone and she left me a voicemail. So she would leave me a voicemail in my office. Then she would call my cell phone and leave me a voicemail to let me know that she had called my office, and it would be the same sort of energy. She would send me an email to let me know that she had called me in both of those places. And then lastly, she would then, of course, text me. Everybody has a friend like Terry. And she truly has the energy of the Energizer Bunny. And so about 2014, it was January of 2014, I recall this because this was the month after we had closed out our first annual fund campaign, end of year appeal, fundraising appeal, since I had been here. I came in January of 2013, as I mentioned. And Terry had a different sound about her voice. I answered the phone. I'm like, "This is Trent." She said, "Trent, hey, this is Terry. How are you?" And I'm like, I'm fine. It was a very somber tone. It was completely uncharacteristic of any conversation I'd ever had with Terry. And she says, "I wanted to ask you a question. I'd been, wanting to ask you this during the course of your annual fund as we were doing the praying for it, and I didn't. And, do you have a minute?" I said, "Sure." And she said, "Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but my dad has cancer." And I said, "I totally did not know that your dad had cancer. Terry, I'm so very sorry to hear that." And she said, "We went to the oncologist a couple of weeks ago." And she said, he got in the car and he said, "I think it's time for us to call hospice." And there was a long pause. And long pauses were not really part of Terry's conversation at all. In fact, it was rare that anyone ever had the opportunity to get a word in edgewise with Terry. And so I knew the silence was incredibly different. And I said, "Terry, are you there?" And she said, "Yes, I'm here." And her voice was markedly different, and I could tell she was beginning to cry. And I said, "Terry, please tell me what's going on." She said, "My dad is giving up. He wants hospice." And I said, "This is not your dad giving up. choosing hospice could quite possibly be the most selfless act of self-determination that he or anybody else could ever make. It probably means that he understands where he is in the course of his treatment. It probably means that he is afraid of you and your mom and the rest of your family becoming completely overwhelmed with the or being burdened with caring for him. And it probably also means that he's worried that his quality of life is going to be substantially diminished for whatever period of time he may have available. It was a long pause. She said, I never thought of it that way. And she said, let me talk to my mom, let me talk to my family. So Terry wound up, her dad wound up coming on to hospice services. He lived about another 55 days or so, 45, 55 days, something like that. About 6 weeks after he passed away, I sent her a card because I knew this would be hard for her. She was very close to her dad. And I waited about 6 weeks because in a 6 week span of time, everybody is really mostly gone, right? The phone calls have stopped coming. The people from the church have picked up all of their casserole dishes with their, masking tape names on the bottom of it. And so I reached out, just sent her a card, and she called me. And she said, Trent, I want to tell you, she said, you were absolutely right. She said, it was an incredibly sad thing. I miss my dad very deeply. She said, but it was a wonderful thing for my family. My dad was at peace. He was incredibly comfortable. And you're right. It needed to happen for us. But I'm glad that we did it for him. It was an incredibly heartwarming story for me, and certainly was the beginning of what would be many stories that I would accumulate in my time here. But one of two that are incredibly personal to me, because she is in fact a very dear friend. And so having the opportunity to provide those services to someone who had a tremendous impact on my life was incredibly meaningful to me. Second story I'll tell you is about my Aunt June. My Aunt June, my mother's middle sister, she was about 62 or 63 years old when she passed away. She had stage 4 pancreatic cancer for about 4.5 years, which is really unheard of. She's in about the 0.01% group of the population that lives for longer than about 2 years. She certainly beat a lot of statistics. Towards the end of her illness, not surprisingly, she was in and out of the hospital quite a lot. I knew that the things that she was having done while she was in the hospital were really palliative in nature and not curative in nature, because we really all understood, whether we acknowledged it or not, we all understood that her prognosis was grim from the beginning, but was growing more grim each and every year. An interesting segue for that is that my mom is a nurse. My cousin, my aunt's daughter, is a nurse practitioner, albeit a neonatal nurse practitioner. And so they understood quite clearly all of the medical considerations that were happening to my aunt and the reasons for which they were happening. What was so interesting to me is that I watched my mother and my cousin not be a daughter and a sister, but really just be another member of the family. It was particularly interesting to me, particularly because my aunt, who was sick, my grandmother, who's still alive, and my aunt's husband relied on them to help her make decisions. And everyone knew and understood the gravity of the diagnosis that she had, particularly as it waxed on for a number of years. But one day I made mention to my mother, who is a nurse, as I mentioned, of perhaps it was time to talk about a palliative care consult, because my aunt was in and out of the hospital fairly regularly at that time. And my mom was going to hear no part of that. She was very offended that I even broached that topic with her. And it was a pretty interesting conversation for me, not one that I am ready to recall or ready to recall easily. But suffice it to say, I'm pretty sure my ears got lowered a little bit that day. And my mother very plainly stated to me that my aunt was not ready to give up. And no convincing on my part was going to change her mind of that at all. So I did what I thought was the next best thing. I waited one of the last hospitalizations that my aunt had till I knew everybody was going to be gone. And I went over and I sat down in my aunt's hospital room. And I said, June, I said, how are you doing? I didn't ask her how she was feeling. I knew how she was feeling. She was in the hospital and she was dying of cancer. But I said, tell me what's on your mind. She said, I'm dying. Just as clearly as I'm sitting here looking at my webcam talking to you all today. And she says, I'm dying. And I wasn't exactly prepared for that. Didn't really know how to respond to that. So I just sort of, took that in for what it was worth. And I just held a little bit of space for a period of time. And I said, okay. I said, well, what are you thinking about that? I said, you get up every day that you're at home and you're coming to the cancer center to get a chemo treatment that invariably you can't get because this is too high or this is too low or this doesn't work or that's not right, about something related to your physiology. And she said, I understand that. And I said, but you do it. And she said, well, it's what they want me to do. And I said, who's they? And, the ubiquitous they, right? And she said, well, that was her husband, my cousin, my other aunt, my mom, my grandmother. Was a lot of people who were involved in her life that were helping her make these decisions. But I think she was really probably making them for others, not necessarily for her, because she, as I just mentioned, had acknowledged to me that she was dying. So I asked her, would she be interested in having a conversation with a physician that I thought might be able to help her put that into some context, help her unpack that just a little bit, and then help the rest of the family sort of deal with what that might actually mean. And she said that would be fine. So I reached out to a palliative care doctor whom I knew, and I asked him quite pointedly, I said, listen, or I actually told him one thing, then asked him another thing. I told him that I am writing you because I know you. I said, I'm writing you because my aunt's in the hospital and I have no authority to talk whatsoever on her behalf and have no ability to receive any information about her medical services. But it sure would be a tremendous favor to me if you'd just at least go introduce yourself, because I asked her if she would mind that and she said she didn't. So he went and introduced himself, and through a series of conversations that transpired over the next several days, my aunt actually went home with hospice care. And she lived about 45 days later. And that was incredibly difficult. It was difficult for my grandmother because she wasn't supposed to outlive her daughter. It was difficult for my mother because my mother and my other aunt were all very good friends, had been their entire life. And so that was an incredibly difficult loss for my family. What was so interesting about all of that, though, is fast forward to the visitation at the church. I went to the church. I went through the visitation line. I saw my grandmother and I said, Grandma, I said, how are you doing? She said, how am I supposed to be doing? She was mad. She was really mad. And she said, I'm not supposed to outlive my children. I said, I understand that. And I said, I leaned into her just a little bit. I said, Grandma, I said, a lot of people don't get to do what June did. And a lot of people don't get to choose what the end of their life might actually look like. She was comfortable. She was in her home. She was surrounded by you and all the people that were near and dear to her for her entire life. And I said, but most importantly, in the last 5 years, anytime she said, I want to go somewhere, everybody went. And when I say that, I mean, everybody went. It was a family affair. Everybody went. You were expected to go. If it was to Colorado, if it was to the beach, it did not matter when or where you were supposed to go. And that is exactly what happened in the last 5 years of her life. And I said, those are the memories that no one can ever take away from you. And those are the things that will be a blessing for you for the entire rest of your life. Because when would you have ever done that? Because we would have been so focused on living our lives that we would have forgotten, perhaps in those last 5 years, how to actually live our life. She leaned back, she looked at me, and she said, I never thought of it that way. And the next day at the church service, we were we're sitting there. I'm the oldest grandchild, so my grandmother was sitting to my right, and there were a couple people down. Then there's my brother, my sister-in-law, and my mother. And we were sitting in the church. We were getting ready to stand up and leave. It was a very beautiful service. I would have expected no less. And the beginning refrains of ABBA's Dancing Queen began to resonate throughout the entire First Baptist Church. I was mortified. I was confident that someone had made a dire mistake, that someone had misplaced or miscued the music, that surely we were supposed to be walking out to something far more somber than ABBA's Dancing Queen. And I feel a tap on my left shoulder. It was my mother, who said that was her favorite song. I leaned forward to my grandmother and I said, this was her favorite song. I never knew this. My whole life I've known my aunt. I never knew this was her favorite song. And she said, oh, it was. Like, how could you not know that? It was an incredibly poignant moment for me in my life, but it was an incredibly sober reminder that my aunt had fulfilled everything that she wanted. She understood her needs, wants, and priorities. And somehow she was able to have articulated that even in a severely debilitated state to my aunt, my mother, my cousin, and most importantly to my grandmother. And so it's an incredibly poignant story, an incredibly sad story, but one with great meaning to me for what we were able to provide to her and to my family. So I think all of that is really important. Those are two stories that I think have a profound impact on me for what we do as an organization, and something that I think resonates with many people across our entire service area, because my experience is not unique. My experience is pretty similar to what others have experienced. So I do have one more bullet on this slide, I do believe. Individuals who receive hospice care live on average 25% longer. We talked about that already. Families receive bereavement aftercare following their loss. I think that's really important. Many families take a significant amount of interest in bereavement aftercare. Some do and some don't. It really depends on the family. It really is a pretty interesting thing to watch, actually. In our Grief Counseling Center, we provide services to anyone in the community who has experienced a loss, whether they were served by our organization or not. There are many people who die in our community that are not served by a hospice organization, and those individuals' families are eligible to come and receive grief counseling services in our Grief Counseling Center free of charge. And so what's interesting about that is every year, as we look at the service statistics, about 40% of the patients or the clients that we serve in our Grief Counseling Center are attributed to a hospice patient, and about 60% are what we call community bereaved and are not connected in any way to any of our hospice patients. Which tells me, much like my own family's experience, that we did a really good job of preparing the family for the end of life. And I think that is a tremendous accolade for what our staff actually do every single day. It's incredibly tremendous. What we do in a nutshell, we help people live life on their terms. I mean, that is really, really, really important. Hospice care isn't the difference between choosing curative treatment and doing nothing. It's really about how you organize your needs, wants, and priorities in a way to live a better life, to have a life that's more fulfilling, to have a life that is of better quality than the life that perhaps you may have when you first pick up the phone and decide to call us. That certainly was the case for my aunt, and certainly was the case for my dear friend Terry and her family, and certainly for her father. So it isn't a choice between doing nothing and doing and curative treatment. It's really about how you organize your life to effectuate something better. Are there differences in hospice organizations? Absolutely. There are both for-profit and not-for-profit hospice organizations. As I mentioned, we are a 501c3 not-for-profit hospice organization. We are a standalone independent organization. There are for-profit hospice organizations in our community. There are about 22 different organizations that serve our individual service area. About half of them are not-for-profit, and about half of them are for-profit. I believe the difference between for-profit and not-for-profit, not only does the service differ from organization to organization, but the approach is a little different. We care more about our patients and their families than we do about our shareholders. So we are a very mission-centric organization. We value the considerations of our mission of connecting individuals to the care they need on the terms they choose. We have a responsibility to be good financial stewards of the dollars that have been entrusted to us, but we believe that they are served best by doing the work that we are charged with doing in our community. It's a misconception that all hospice organizations are connected to one another. We've already talked about that. The fact is that hospice organizations are all independent of one another. We've talked about that too. And there is a variety of different approaches to the type of care delivery that we provide in our organization to the way care is provided in another hospice organization. And as I mentioned, there are 22 different independent hospice organizations that serve our 8-county service area: Guilford, Randolph, Davidson, Forsyth, Chatham, Alamance, Moore, and Montgomery counties. So we have a very large service area. And you can see just to the side there, as a nonprofit hospice, we serve our patients, not our shareholders, because all hospice organizations are not created equal. What makes us different? You know, we live and work in the communities we serve. All of the folks that you met, my colleagues, Sue and Ryan and David and Dawn, we all live in the communities that we serve. We all live within our service area. We're not an organization that's headquartered in another state or even in another part of the state and just happen to serve the Piedmont Triad area of the state. That's not true at all. We live and work right here. We care for individuals regardless of their ability to pay or independent of their financial circumstance. Financial means testing is not part of our admissions process. It is not the primary consideration for us. We first determine whether or not you need the services that we have available to offer to you, and then we determine whether or not you have insurance or whether or not you would be eligible for a full or sliding scale subsidy. Our responsibility is to provide the service. And part of our, as I mentioned, our unwritten social contract with the community is we'll continue to provide the service regardless of an individual's ability to pay or financial circumstance in exchange for your willingness to help support our organization financially throughout the year. We consistently exceed state and national benchmarks for family satisfaction measures, and we're a paid staff of over 200 individuals, 9 medical providers, and an active core of more than 200 volunteers who provide care to more than 2,000 individuals each and every year. That is astounding. 220 individuals, 9 medical providers, 2,000 patients that we serve each and every year, and 200 volunteers. It is astounding at the magnitude of the reach that our organization has. In fact, beyond those 2,000 patients that we're caring for, we have about another 6,000 or 7,000 touch points during the course of any given year through programs like our Seasons bereavement mailings, through other engagements that we may have, or through other fundraising engagements that we may have within the community, or even just from speaking engagements, of which we are happy to do. We love to go out and talk to groups in the community about who we are and what we do, and help dispel myths and misconceptions about what hospice care really is. So some questions. Before we get to some questions, I think it's important to note that being a volunteer for our organization could really mean a lot of things. It could be holding somebody's hand, but it could mean changing a life, even if it's your own. I've had the occasion over the last several years to read the electronic volunteer logs that our volunteers are submitting, and it is truly amazing at the level of engagement that they have with our patients and their families. It's truly, it is a reminder of why we do what we do. And one of the things that I think even most importantly, I've sat here and talked with you for a very long time this afternoon. And I think what's even most important is that our volunteers have taught me over the last 7 years is this concept of holding space, of simply just understanding that being present is sometimes the most important thing that you can offer to any individual. I got asked once at a presentation I was making at a UNCG gerontology class a lady in the back of the room, she asked me, she said, what kind of activities do your patients generally like to do? And I had to stop and think for just a moment, because I'm thinking, well, most of them really don't do a lot of activities. You know, they're not up doing a lot of, they don't have a lot of physical functioning oftentimes. And if they do, it comes with great exertion. And I said, well, I said, you know, what they enjoy most is just having someone to sit and talk with them and just listen. And I think that's absolutely as true today as it was the day I spoke it. Some good reads and great resources. Being Mortal, many of you may have heard of that, or some of you may have read it. It was a New York Times bestseller by Atul Gawande, who is a physician, actually a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and also on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. A Conversation, a Revolutionary Plan for End-of-Life Care, also by a physician, Angelo Volandes, who is an intensivist and ICU physician. The Conversation Project, of which we are a partner, a community partner. It's really about the importance of having important conversations around both living and dying, and what that actually means for people. Founded by Ellen Goodman, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from the Boston Globe. Let's Have Dinner and Talk About Death, which is really just a very interesting catalyst for engaging people in your family about really sensitive topics about living and dying, things that are most important to them, things like needs, wants, and priorities, and how you begin to have a conversation about that. So all of those are great reads and great resources. Let me go back. Whoops. So there we go. As we move ahead, I'm going to show you a video, a series of videos, actually. I think the first video may be a little bit hard to hear, but who better than to talk to you about being a volunteer than volunteers themselves? So you're going to hear from some of our existing volunteers, and I think you'll really love the stories that they're going to tell you. So.
When I first started thinking about volunteering in general, I was looking for something that would be significant to do. My husband's parents were both taken care of by hospice, and so it was a natural fit for me to look at hospice as a possibility for what I wanted to do with my volunteering years.
I chose to volunteer with Hospice of Piedmont because I wanted to continue to use the talents and skills and abilities that I have. I retired as a minister several years ago, and so I wanted to continue to minister to people, and I thought this was an excellent way to do that.
I think the main reason I started to volunteer with hospice, my kids were younger and I needed a little bit more fulfillment in my life, and I have always loved to help other people. My mom was a nurse, and I just felt, I don't know, a calling. So I called Hospice Home, and they were, Hospice Piedmont, and they were doing one of their volunteer classes, and I decided to give it a try, and I have loved it ever since.
As a bereavement volunteer, I make phone calls to families, usually usually it's within 4 to 6 weeks after the loss of their loved one. And my connection to them is to encourage them that they are not forgotten, that we still think about them, and that also we're here for them. Particularly with bereavement, we are here with counselors or groups or activities that might help them through their difficulties.
A typical visit for me depends on where I'm going. If it's a home visit, it's a little bit to me more personal. You know, they're letting me into their home. I try to get acquainted with the caregiver, whether it be a spouse or a child, a grown child of the patient, animals, anything. And typically you go in and wherever the patient is, whether it's in their bedroom or the family room, and I sit down and I like to let them do all the talking if they can, and I may just open up with questions, and I never really have a problem finding stuff to talk about because you'd be surprised how they just want somebody to listen to them that doesn't have anything to do with why they're with hospice. I don't know, that may sound weird, but sometimes they just want to talk, and I really just like to go in and listen.
My visits to the patients that I have and the things that I do vary. It's just according to well-being of the patient that I see. For instance, I had one patient. I would visit him in the nursing home. Occasionally, he and I would walk through the nursing home, and sometimes he and I would go riding in my car. He wanted to get out one day and return to Winston-Salem, where he and his late wife lived, and he wanted to go to Chick-fil-A to have a meal at this restaurant. So we did that. Other times we play games, we talk, and sometimes we just sit and be quiet.
Volunteering for hospice means to me hope. They give hope to so many people. Like I said, even my dad, and I have other family members that have been serviced through hospice, and it's been so much hope.
In one word, volunteering for hospice, I would say rewarding. Because I have made somebody's day, hopefully, by making them smile or taking away their pain for an hour of just talking about their past. And to me, that is very rewarding to know that at the end of the day that I've, made a small impact in their life one way or another.
I think volunteering for hospice, if I could just say it in one word, I would probably say fulfillment, because it brings fulfillment to me. And I think when I'm looking for an experience as a volunteer, I particularly want to be useful, to be used in a way that is valuable. And I think being a hospice volunteer is
I want others to know about volunteering with hospice is giving of yourself. We need you. People need you. Even when my dad needed, and I couldn't be there, hospice was there, because I even went through a period where I was sick for a period of time, and hospice was always there giving, and my dad was just so happy and content, and it just did my heart good to know that he was taken care of.
Hospice is an excellent organization to volunteer because it gives you an opportunity to help someone in their greatest need. Not only the patient, but the family members as well.
The main question that I always get from people when they find out that I volunteer with hospice is, how can you do that? Isn't that depressing? And they're surprised by my answer because volunteering for hospice is the exact opposite. I look forward to my visits with my patients. They all know why they're there. They all know why I'm there. And putting a smile on somebody else's face or letting them know that I care about them as a complete stranger, it's surprising how much that means to them. I have never experienced a depressing situation. They're uplifting to me. They make my day. It makes me value life more. I can bring it home to my family as far as my purpose and why I'm there. And so when people ask me how I can do it, I just basically say they give me something that I don't get anywhere else. And to me, that is very rewarding and fulfilling.
Volunteering at Hospice of the Piedmont has been a wonderful experience for me. It's using some of the skills and gifts that I have been using my whole life, but using it in a way that brings significance and value to both me and to the people that I work with.
So, wow, you've heard from a few of our volunteers, Veronica, Barb, CW, and Cher. Cher Limpock is they're all amazing ladies and gentlemen. CW Moss was a former chaplain for the High Point Police Department and is one of our auxiliary chaplains, I believe, as well. And a truly amazing fellow. Veronica, an equally amazing lady, has given countless hours of service to our organization. Each of these individuals that you've heard from are patient family volunteers, so they actually engage directly with patients and families. And you might imagine that over the last several months that has looked really different. Our volunteer services have been mostly paused for a period of time, but we're in the process of re-engaging our volunteers in meaningful ways and safe ways because many of our patients and their families have truly missed the connectivity that they get with our volunteers, but more importantly, our volunteers have actually missed the connections that they have with our patients and families. So each of those individuals will be re-engaging in different ways with our organization. You know, volunteers, I'd like to take just a moment, if I might, to make mention of all the different things that volunteers do. Volunteers do many different things in our organization. They not only go and see patients and families, which is incredibly rewarding, they also perform administrative tasks in either our Randolph Hospice House or a hospice home at High Point. They sort supplies, they put admission notebooks together, they perform many important administrative tasks within our organization and provide an invaluable amount of support to many of us in the organization, and for which we are incredibly grateful. Being a volunteer in our organization is more than just showing up and doing something. It truly is about making a commitment. It's about making a commitment not only to honoring our mission and furthering our mission, but most importantly for us, we take volunteering very seriously. Our volunteers are screened just like employees are. So anybody who's interested in becoming a volunteer has to complete an application just like an employee would, has to submit to an interview, has to have a complete background check. If you haven't lived in North Carolina for the last 5 years, we're going to ask you to do some fingerprinting for us. So a pretty extensive process just to become a volunteer. That's how important volunteers are to our organization. You know, but engaging with us couldn't be more simple. It begins with what you're doing today, which is learning about our organization, learning about who we are, learning about our commitment, not only to our community, but also to our patients and their families, and then learning how you might be able to help support that in a meaningful way for you. So the next steps are to fill out an application if you haven't already done so. Sign up for an interview, complete the interview and background check process. And if you're unsure whether or not you want to be a volunteer, you might think about doing a shadowing visit where we would pair you with a home care volunteer to explore what that actually looks like. There are some stipulations that come with that. We would require you to have a TB skin test, and you'd have to have a signed confidentiality agreement to be completed in advance. Our goal as we restart our volunteer services in the next several weeks, as you might imagine, is to keep everyone as COVID protected as we possibly can. And so we've armed our volunteers with many of the same considerations that our paid staff are using to help screen or actually to screen all of the patients that we may be seeing. And so this is a soft start for us. We are one of the few organizations in the larger Piedmont Triad community, one of the few hospice organizations that is beginning to believe that it is a safe venture for us to bring back volunteers in a very smart, prudent, and safe manner. Insofar as we believe that that is a possibility in today's times. And we believe that is possible.